Hi everyone. So this is a little presentation that I put together for the ARC Training Centre for Critical Resources for the Future, the CCRF, which held a workshop just before the SEG in Brisbane in 2025. So I thought I'd share the content with you just to give this knowledge to more people. So for optical petrography, for geology applications, we need to prepare our samples into thin sections. Thin sections are a 30 micron piece of rock, which is glued onto a glass slide. These can either have a glass cover slip put over the top of them or have a polished surface. Sometimes we make thick sections, which are 100 microns thick, but these are for specific applications, which I'll talk about a bit later. Or we can do epoxy rounds, which are little pieces of rock mounted in epoxy resin and then polished on their surface. So a petrographic microscope is a pretty simple piece of technology. We have a light at the base which shines through a polarizer and then hits our sample and then goes up through the binocular lenses or camera where we observe it. In plain polarized light, most minerals are either clear or have a slight coloration to them. We can also use cross-polarized light, which is light coming through the base, going through a polarizer, going through our sample, and then going through a second crossed polarizer, so at 90 degrees, and then going through where we observe it. So this causes all of the beautiful birefringence colors in our mineral and really helps us to identify which mineral is which. The third type of optical microscopy is reflected light microscopy. So this is light coming through the top of the microscope down onto the sample and then back up where we observe it. And this is for minerals that are not transparent, even at 30 microns thick, and are usually used for like ore mineral applications. So the main reason we use optical microscopy in geology is for mineral identification. It is one of the most rapid and confident ways to identify mineralogy. Most geologists just look at the rock with a hand lens and can have a pretty good idea of what each mineral is. But to be super confident, you do have to make it into a thin section and observe it at a micro scale so that you can understand the relationships of those minerals. On the right here, I have an example of pleochroism in biotite, which is one of the identifying features of that mineral and is pretty beautiful. So for all the sedimentologists in the room, microfossils are extremely important in sedimentology. They help us to determine past climates and past environments and even the age of the rock if you can identify what species each of the little microfossils is. It also helps us to work out stratigraphy over long distances, so you can match up the fossil-bearing units across long distances. Sedimentology is great, but as an igneous petrologist, I think that igneous rocks win the prize for the most beautiful thin sections in geology. Looking at thin sections, you can really understand the texture of the rocks, especially if it's very fine grained. You do need a microscope to understand the texture in detail. Here is an example of deformation that you can see in this garnet surrounded by biotites, where it has strange shadows and it has a bit of rotation of this garnet as well. If we have an igneous system, we can do the flow directions of any lava or flowing magma. We can look at large crystals and see which ones are single crystals, like oikocrysts and porphyroblasts. And we can understand paragenesis, so which minerals come before each other mineral. So here it's an example of observing texture in a thin section that we can't really see if we're looking at SEM or TEMA. So if the minerals that are touching each other are the same composition, the SEM and TEMA will just display them as the same color or the same backscattered brightness intensity. But if you look at it in thin sections, you can see where one crystal ends and the other begins and understand how each crystal relates to each other. and whether or not you have like microcrystalline aggregates or just one very large crystal. We can also work out formation conditions from optical microscopy. This is a large kyanite grain which has started to pseudomorph into sillimanite, so we know that we started in a high pressure environment and then have dropped into lower pressure as this crystal formed. So we can understand pseudomorphs, we can understand pressure, temperature, time paths, we can understand if we've had some recrystallization occurring or even resorption. So this is an example from the Nova Bollinger deposit that was published by one of our interns in 2021, and it's a bunch of olivine crystals next to plagioclase crystals, and at very, very high pressures these are happily coexisting and co-crystallizing, but as we drop to lower pressures they don't like to exist together anymore, so they create these massive reaction rims that consists of orthopyroxene and amphibole, and also these clinopyroxene spinel symplectites, which are just beautiful to look at in both cross-polarized light and in micro XRF from the synchrotron. So you can also see chemical zonation in thin section. So this is an example of looking at a pyroxene that is zoned in chromium content, and it's difficult to see, but you can see it in thin section. You can see when the chromium content changes in this pyroxene. However, if the major elements change, like in this plagioclase where it moves from calcic to sodic and back and forth between calcic and sodic, you can really see that easily in thin sections as well. So this is letting us know that we have really active systems and that there's changes in the formation conditions while that crystal's been growing. We can also do fluid inclusion studies using optical microscopy. For this application, we usually use thicker, thin sections. So usually the rock is about 180 microns thick. This just allows us to observe a larger volume of the fluid inclusions. This allows us to look at the pressure and temperature of the formation of these rocks, and also gives us a little bit of information about the ore forming fluid in a lot of cases. So you can look at the proportion of the vapor to the liquid in each of the fluid inclusions. You can sometimes see that there are tiny little crystals in the fluid inclusions that gives you an idea of their composition, and you can also heat these fluid inclusions back up until they homogenize, which gives you an idea of what temperature these might have formed at. So everything I've showed you so far is transmitted light microscopy, so that's the light coming from the bottom of the sample up through the sample. For ore microscopy, our ore minerals are often not transparent, so we use reflected light microscopy. This gives us an idea of what our ore minerals are and their relationship to gangue minerals. So in this case, we have lots of gold associated with pyrite and some chalcopyrite and some galena. We can understand the size of our ore minerals and our deportment, so how much of the ore mineral we have in our samples. So the most important bit for this workshop is that optical microscopy is cheap. It can give us context for our further microanalysis. All microanalysis equipment are extremely expensive, and all time on the machine is money that you have to spend. So if you have a plan by using optical observations to map out which mineral phases are important or what areas you want to target in your sample, you can set up a roadmap for your analysis and get the best bang for your buck out of your day on the more advanced analytical equipment. Some things to consider about optical microscopy. Making thin sections with cover slips is cheaper because it requires less polishing, but it inhibits any further microanalysis. So if you find something interesting, you can't take these samples to the electron microprobe or any other surface analysis technique because it has that slide of glass on top. So I recommend doing polished thin sections when you can. The standard thickness of thin sections is 30 microns, and sometimes this is a little bit too thin for some destructive analysis like laser ablation ICP-MS in some minerals, especially ones that are a bit softer. So if you have grand plans of doing analysis that is destructive, you might need to get a thicker thin section. And finally, collecting samples and making thin sections is expensive. So doing field campaigns or drilling to collect these samples is extremely expensive, and then adding the cost of creating those thin sections is also expensive. So you've created an asset, and I recommend that you store and catalog these assets appropriately for future use and future research. So thank you for listening to this very short little talk about optical petrography in geology. Here's a little example of the same thin section that was taken with plain polarized light, cross-polarized light, laser-induced breakdown spectroscopy, scanning electron microscopy, and automated mineralogy, and also X-ray fluorescence. So you can have a bit of a see about all the different techniques and how optical microscopy is the most beautiful. Thank you.